there's a lot of evidence that even just the way we take in a scene and then remember it has to do with the cultures that we're in. So, for example, Americans will remember if you show them a scene with a fish swimming in a landscape, they'll remember a lot about the fish and very little about the background. Whereas you show Japanese people the same scene, they'll remember maybe fewer details of the main fish that was in the front, but they'll remember more about how all the different parts of the environment fit together.
So this is a conversation that I had with Paul Smaldino, who is an associate professor of cognitive and information sciences at the University of California, Merced. And what I find fascinating about Paul's work is his work in cultural evolution, specifically the way in which culture and cultural phenomena can emerge almost organically simply from the behavior of the individuals who make up that culture. So Paul has this brilliant online course called Models of Social Dynamics, which captures this, the idea that you can program simple rules that individuals in an ecosystem, in a society, in a culture follow. And in the aggregate, all of these individuals following their own individual rules produces, if you take a high level viewpoint, this sort of emergent cultural phenomena. Things like markets or warfare, wealth inequality, cooperation. A lot of the social dynamics that we see in our everyday life aren't necessarily coordinated by a central leader, but are simply the products of all of these individuals going about their own daily lives, following their own rules. So this sort of intersection of cultural evolution, complexity theory, emergent phenomena, this is the ground that we cover. I really hope that you enjoyed the conversation we had. All right, Paul Smaldino, thank you so much for joining me. Welcome to, whatever this podcast turns out to be. You are the inaugural conversation. So welcome.
Thanks for having me.
I was reading through your CV and I couldn't help but feel a little bit of a connection with you already based on that, due to the jumping around that you seem to do early in your career, doing multiple sort of different jobs before you seem to have found your feet doing, the research that you're doing in cultural evolution and related areas. So I'm really curious. I'm in that stage of life right now, to be frank. Like I am doing a lot of kind of random things, and I've even worked in film and TV as well. So I'm just curious, what was there a sort of a common thread throughout sort of all of the stuff that you've done, and what's your story into how'd you get to where you are right now?
There's a lot of ways I could answer that question probably. Both my parents were psychotherapists, and for better or worse, and I feel like there was always I always felt sort of, I guess, privileged and entitled enough to sort of figure out a path for myself and find something for myself, and a lot of, I feel like, what I've worked on is trying to figure out where I fit into the world, and then think about how everyone figures out how they fit into the world and how the world works at all. I was just sort of interested in how the world works. And when I went to college, I studied physics, but I also just wanted to have fun, and I like the arts. And so I took a lot of arts and humanities. And so my coursework in undergraduate was all physics and math, and then humanities and arts. And I never took any biology or social science, which I guess is unusual for someone who studies now social science and behavior. And then after I graduated, I remember about a few days before my undergraduate graduation, I basically had a panic attack, and I realized I had no idea what I was going to do with my life at all. And I thought, well, I'd like to do something that means something. And I thought maybe I'll be a doctor, which is just a very misguided idea on my part, because I'm really not cut out temperamentally for that. I'm very bad at very high stakes, short term kind of things where I have to make a decision right away and it's going to be very, very important. I'm this is the only job I ever got fired from. Was my first job after college was as a lab tech in a hospital, in an immunology lab, and I got fired um, for losing, I think mostly for losing a sample, just out of carelessness, and I felt horrible about it. Um, and I realized that wasn't for me. And then I had a just sort of panoply of different jobs, and yeah, music and film and random office jobs and proofreading and etc. And I just got really interested in human behavior, and I didn't know anything about the science of human behavior, the science of mind, or social science, or psychology. I thought psychology meant therapy, like psychotherapy, which is, I think, a very common misunderstanding. Um, and yeah, I ended up getting a job as a psychiatric nurse's aide in a psych ward in a hospital. Um, but the only place they were hiring was forensic psychiatry. So I ended up working at Bellevue Hospital in New York, like basically giving lunch to people who were like schizophrenics who had thrown their grandmother out of a window and various kinds of things. It was really intense. And I realized, yeah, yeah, I mean, it was it's probably a poor choice of word, but it's what comes to mind. It was a crazy time. Um, and I started studying psychology more seriously. And I think I ended up, I had no idea that such a thing like cultural evolution, or even like evolutionary anthropology, or um, social psychology, or even cognitive psychology, I barely knew anything about when I started this stuff. Um, but I spent a lot of time with friends and stuff talking about like the problems with the world and how to make the world better. And I just remember having this thought that, yeah, we can figure out what the world is like. We know what the world is like now, and we could have this idea of this utopian, what could the world be in our imagination. But there's this intermediate where you have to figure out, how do you get from where we are now to any sort of future state. And it's not obvious that you could get from, even if you can imagine a perfect world, how do you get there from where we are now? And so I just wanted to know more about how people work and how society works, to sort of think about even just what's possible. And so I ended up applying to PhD programs in psychology because that was what I was exposed to. And I ended up really fortunately at UC Davis, the University of California, Davis, working in the psychology department in biological psychology, which is great because I learned a lot of stuff about animal behavior and neuroscience and all sorts of cool stuff. But really, luckily, at the time, UC Davis was a hub for the study of cultural evolution and human behavioral ecology. So I was in the psych department, but over in the anthropology department and in the environmental science department were people like Pete Richardson and Richard McElreath and Monique Borgerhoff Mulder and Bruce Winterhalter and all these amazing people, Mark Lubell, these incredible people who were sort of applying principles of evolutionary theory and behavioral ecology to the study of human behavior. And I just found a natural fit with them. I would talk to the people in the psych department about what I was interested in or what I was working on, and they would look at me very blankly. It just wasn't something that made sense to them or was interesting to them. And then I would go and talk to these other people, and they got what I was doing, and they had great suggestions for how to make it better. And so I just naturally gravitated toward that. And that was sort of naturally in a very interdisciplinary group. So I never really thought that hard about what discipline I was in. I just wanted to study the things I was studying.
Right, which were ultimately tied back to making sense of the world and your place in the world, and and well, how everybody can sort of find, I guess, put their own kind of life in the bigger context. At least that's the way that I see it. That's my sort of fascination with culture evolution, is like the idea that there are these sort of I guess, general or universal sort of patterns that determine how human societies sort of function across time. Is that sort of fair? Like, what if for sort of like, this is sort of for the intelligent, lay person, that's who would probably be listening to this sort of podcast. What do they need to sort of understand about cultural evolution and what it is?
Yeah, I think that it's if you wanted to understand, let's say, the motion of a cannonball through the air, right? There are principles that people studying physics and the like have uncovered about the way that objects moving through space just have the way they behave, right? There's gravitation, there's friction, there's wind resistance, etc. And these ideas then provide scaffolds for tackling new kinds of problems relatedly. And the way we have sort of historically thought about thinking about the way that humans work has been largely atheoretical. And oh, well, you ask people to come up with explanations and they just kind of use their own experience and try to map their own experience onto what they see and what they hear about. Cultural evolution and related fields have been gathering up sort of general principles about the way humans work throughout history and across different societies, and what is common to most cultures and most human groups, and also the ways in which they differ, which isn't random but systematic. So principles about the way that groups cooperate or don't cooperate, the way that norms work, the way that behaviors spread or don't spread, the way people learn from each other or don't learn from each other, the way that signals transmit information about identity for coordination. And these kinds of general principles about cooperation and norms and enforcement and social learning, among other things, then provide new scaffolds for us to develop richer and richer theories and come up with better hypotheses about the way human societies work in general, and how, and to understand differences between human societies as well.
Right. So one of the things you mentioned there was that, cooperation within groups. And I think this might be like a good sort of example or case study to make some of these ideas concrete. Because I think a lot of people have this intuitive sense, or at least it's sort of in the pop culture, that like humanity as a whole will only kind of unite when we have a common enemy, right? Like an alien civilization is going to come, and that's what's going to like cause us all to finally like be one big human tribe. But it seems that might not be like too far from the truth in terms of the way that there's a dynamic between cooperating within a group of similarly culturally similar people versus an out group of people who are different than us. So can you say a little bit about that dynamic or that tension?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've hit upon something really important. Humans are really remarkable and unusual among animal species to the extent to which we are cooperative. Most animals are basically solitary. They don't interact a lot with other animals of the same species except for mating and child rearing. And often in mammals, child rearing is just the job of the mother. There are a number of social species. There's lots of examples: meerkats and mole rats and monkeys. For the most part, cooperation, even in those groups, takes place among kin, so close relatives. And this is something that evolutionary biologists understand, that it makes sense if you're in a group that sort of maintains a structure over time. If you're going to help others to survive and reproduce, even at a cost, if they share your genes, you're still helping your genes reproduce, even if it's not the genes that come from your own gametes, right? Humans cooperate with people that are unrelated, are unlikely to share genes by common descent, and they cooperate with people who they've never met before and will likely never meet again. And this is incredibly unusual. Um, the reason why that cultural evolutionists have sort of hit upon is exactly what you're talking about, or one of the reasons why. They think there are a number of reasons, and there's a very, very deep literature on trying to understand human cooperation and cooperation in general. But one of the main reasons has to do with the fact that humans are incredibly social, and that sociality allows them to do things that help them, but also compete with other groups. So this is an oversimplification, but if you have two groups that tend to live together, but they are competing generally for the same resources, whether it's food or water or building materials or whatever. And one group is very good at cooperating with each other. They can help each other. They're also going to be better at competing with the other group, whether it's direct things like conflict, and warfare is certainly a kind of cooperation, or indirectly, like they better take advantage of resources and can weather things like droughts or variance in hunting success, let's say. Like if you go out and hunt and you don't get anything, but your neighbor does and shares with you, and then the next time you get something, you share with him, that's a kind of cooperation. And it means that your group is going to be better able to weather those things than some other group that doesn't. This is an idea that's sometimes called cultural group selection, but that the name has these problems where it leads people to think that it's about groups sort of transmitting their norms or institutions wholesale onto other groups. It's really about the fact that the fact of being in a cultural group and not some other cultural group means that you are likely to be interacting with other people that have certain norms, that follow certain rules, that in a society that has certain kinds of institutions. And other people living in other groups are going to be interacting with people who have different norms and follow different institutions. And the fact of those differences is going to influence competition between groups. And whether it's by warfare directly, like one group literally conquering or killing some other group, or by more subtle means like copying. You say, well, that group's doing great, let's do what they do. Or migration, like, I don't like being in my group, it sucks, I'm going to move to the other group where things are better. There's a bunch of these different mechanisms. And when you have cultural structure, it allows for the more cooperative group to outcompete less cooperative groups, and therefore maintains and strengthens our sort of natural cooperation. But it works because there's competition. If we had some big common enemy, like an alien in, let's say, it's Independence Day or some other alien disaster movie, it's possible that everyone would temporarily band together against the alien. But, either we defeat the alien and then the alien goes away and then we're back to square one, because when that foe is gone, then it's not that selection pressure isn't there anymore. Or more insidiously, it stays there and we do have this external threat. So we have this sort of universal, everyone has to cooperate against the threat. But you don't get rid of inequality that way. And this is another thing, that it's not just about cooperation and competition, it's also about scale and structure. So it's not just that groups cooperate, it's that groups are structured in certain ways to where information resources aren't sort of evenly spread. And this is, I think, really key, that when you have things like warfare and competition driving cultural evolution, you don't just get cooperation, you get organizational structures that facilitate efficiency and facilitate sort of better competition. So you get awesome things like technology and innovation, and you also get things like hierarchy and inequality. And these aren't necessarily things that are awesome.
Right. So that in the effort to make ourselves, or the best competitors as a group, we compromise basically the lives, or the well-being in some sense, if we can correlate well-being in some respects with inequality in access to certain resources. We compromise certain members of our own group in order to actually protect the group as a whole, and by proxy actually protect those less well endowed members.
Yeah, I mean, you know, there's a danger from speaking too generally here, because you can always come up with some example that's a bit different, but this kind of thing definitely can happen. Um, if you look at, there's very few other species, except rather than other than humans, that cooperate to the extent that we do. And to get to them, you have to go outside the vertebrates, right? You have to go to things like ants and bees, because they live in communities of hundreds of thousands or millions, and they live in what the biologist Mark Moffat sometimes called as anonymous societies, where you don't have to know someone to cooperate with them, as long as you know that they're part of your group, right? And humans are pretty unique about this relative to other animals, but the other species that do it are the ants and the bees and the termites. And those species are very happy to sacrifice their members for the good of the colony, right? And the individuals are happy to do it too, because they don't know any better, and evolution has shaped their behavior, and their brains only have 90,000 neurons, and they don't know what they're doing. They just are happy little robots, and they do amazing things like build bridges out of their own bodies so that others can walk over them. Humans do things like this too. The tragedy is that we have 100 billion neurons, so we're very aware of what's going on, and we build amazing things on the back of human suffering. And I don't really know. I think that's it's just the way it is.
Yeah. So does that make, like, of all you've learned so far in your scientific career, does it leave you somewhat pessimistic about our opportunity or our possibility of creating like because a better society, obviously, what does that mean? It seems like we're always trading one benefit for another. Is there what are you? I guess the question is, what's your what hope do you see in the cultural evolution literature, if any, for direct application for making our lives better?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think that people more so than me have been very directly trying to apply principles of cultural evolution toward making things better. In terms of things like sustainable practices, and governance. It's very challenging because, well, for a number of reasons, and I'll get into that in a sec. I think that I go through phases. Sometimes I'm more optimistic, and sometimes I'm sort of more fatalistic, maybe. But like, let me see how I can put this. One of the major insights from cultural evolution, and I want to, when I say cultural evolution, I'm not speaking about something that is completely separate from the other fields that it draws from, right? So you may hear me say things like, well, a cultural evolutionary perspective tells us such and such, and you could say, well, but economics knows that, or anthropology knows that, or psychology knows that, and I would respond, yes, absolutely. Cultural evolution is an amalgamate discipline that draws from insights from anthropology and economics and psychology and biology, ecology, etc., and is an integrative rather than a separate discipline. But so thinking about these things, one of the things that comes up again and again is the extent to which selection influences behavior and outcomes. So this is something evolutionary biologists have known forever, right? This is the main idea of Darwinian evolution, is that you have variation in a species, and the environment creates the circumstances such that individuals with specific traits that behave in certain ways, that have certain physical characteristics, that organize socially in particular ways, outcompete others by, in terms of survival and reproduction. And we understand this very well. Well, culture works in similar ways. Behaviors, individually and also group behaviors and social organizational structures that influence outcomes that are better at them getting themselves transmitted, whether it's by having those individuals, by making individuals have more babies, or just by having more influence and having other people learn from them, whether or not they're biologically related, because that's something that's different about cultural evolution, shapes the kind of societies that we end up with. And these things can work in very complex ways. For example, just the way our minds work are often thought to be kind of hard-coded by DNA, but we learn by virtue of the cultures we grow up in. We learn language of the cultures that we grow up in. We learn to perceive things in particular ways. There's a lot of evidence that even just the way we take in a scene and then remember it has to do with the cultures that we're in. So, for example, Americans will remember, if you show them a scene with a fish swimming in a landscape, they'll remember a lot about the fish and very little about the background. Whereas you show Japanese people the same scene, they'll remember maybe fewer details of the main fish that was in the front, but they'll remember more about how all the different parts of the environment fit together. And there's a bunch of examples like this. So there's another example where there's something called the Mueller-Lyer illusion. You probably see this is like in every intro psych textbook, where if you put two lines of the same length and one line has kind of arrows kind of going inward, sort of little line segments that make an arrow, so it's an arrow pointing outward. And then you take another one and you take those same arrowheads, the same little line segments, and flip them so they're sort of jutting outward. The line segment with the arrows, the ends jutting outward, looks longer than the one with the arrows going inward. It just looks longer to us. And everyone in our culture knows this, and every intro psych textbook shows this. It's a very robust result in industrialized societies. But if you take that result to the Kung San Bushmen in Southern Africa, they don't have that illusion. They see the lines the same length. And the proposed reason for this is they live primarily in a landscape without straight lines. And so lines pointing inward is not an indicator of distance. We who live in urban environments with straight lines and straight-sided buildings, we can use the way that lines in our environment fit together as an indicator, as a cue for how far away something is. And if you don't have that growing up, then you don't develop that illusion. Your mind doesn't learn to use that cue. And the environments that shape our development not only differ, but are also subject to selection. Because certain environments that shape our minds working in certain ways are probably beneficial in some communities and not beneficial in others. And this is just one way that cultural evolution works in complicated ways. I kind of lost the thread here, but
So
your original question.
That's all right. That's right. I mean, all of that stuff is absolutely fascinating, and I think like what I'm trying to see is, what's the implications for us? I mean, like, can we then consciously design environments that seem to that are more likely to lead to certain like perspectives of the world that we then know in advance are gonna lead to better outcomes for human happiness, or?
Yeah. So the short answer is yes, but, right? So, yes, we can consciously design environments that select for certain kinds of outcomes and not others, right? We know, for example, that certain features of communities enable the maintenance of cooperative norms of like, let's say, maintaining common resources without over exploiting them. And we see this in a number of this is the economist Eleanor Ostrom won a Nobel Prize for her work on exactly this idea. And in the U.S., there's this classic example of fishermen or lobstermen in Maine in the Northeast who wanted to avoid overfishing, and overexploiting all the lobster because all their livelihoods depended on it. So they worked together to establish norms in order to preserve the lobsters, and it's been pretty effective as far as I know. But there's a lot of buts, right? These are people who are kind of centralized in a particular location. They have a shared interest in an outcome, and in other senses, it's very difficult to get the maintenance of something that is costly or cooperative, where you want something, let's say, a sustainable, happier, more egalitarian world. Let's assume that that's something that many of us want. That does mean that some people who, let's say, are very good at exploiting resources or people are going to have less as a result. It may mean more people get more than a few people get less, but those people are powerful and they don't want that. And if they also control parts of the environment that ends up selecting for the kinds of outcomes we get, then we have these problems. And so cultural evolution, to some extent, could, in a utopian sense, give us guidelines for how to design a better society. But I think more immediately, what it can do is show us where the problems are and where the important targets for change are. Where are the things that are doing real damage, not directly, let's say, by polluting or killing people or whatever, directly harming people. But what are the institutions that select for the maintenance of these kinds of outcomes, that make it so that it's very difficult to change things? I think a really good example has been known for a long time is, I think about all the time these days, is Ed Herman and Noam Chomsky's work on manufacturing consent in the media. The situation is different now than it was in the 1980s when they wrote that book. And so there's a lot more nuances, but I think the general idea is still very, very, very relevant, right? Is if you have a media landscape where you have certain interested parties who decide who gets hired as journalists, who gets put on the air, who gets to be the editor of a newspaper, etc., then certain perspectives are going to get elevated and certain perspectives are not. It doesn't mean that anyone who's in the media is lying. You can have everyone completely committed to telling the truth. But it does mean that certain perspectives and certain truths are not going to get promoted and some will. And that's going to shape the kinds of discussions that happen in public forums. And it's going to shape whether or not certain problems can advance and move past the is there or isn't there a problem phase, which is what we're seeing a lot of.
Yeah. It almost seems as though, what you're saying, that the perspective and I guess the empirical or theoretical support that a cultural evolution view can have on discussions around how we shape and regulate and manage institutions, it's wading into a debate that's already very much alive today, but it might, it because it has that sort of scientific base, maybe it might have some more influence than other perspectives. But it seems it's very much a tightrope, because we're sort of saying on the one hand, like, you are a human being, this is the habitat of human beings, and you're very much influenced by that habitat, but at the same time, um, we've got to consciously engineer our way out of it. I guess what I'm trying to say is it's like this constant dichotomy between like, how influenced you are by society versus thinking that you are like, you have free will, you're an agent. Like, it seems to be a very like philosophical topic.
Yeah. Yeah, the free will is an interesting debate to have. I feel like um, at some point I just decided to behave as if I believed in free will, because to do otherwise just seemed pointless. Maybe I had no choice in that matter, but um, I've heard the argument that free will itself, or belief in free will, is something that you can imagine being subject to cultural evolution. I mean, imagine two groups, one of whom has a norm of believing in personal responsibility and free will, and one who's extremely fatalistic and just assumes, well, everything that happens for a reason and there's nothing you can do about it. Um, One group may be more adaptive to certain kinds of environments than others, especially ones that are highly variable, like the one
Yeah, well,
that
there might
many
there
of
might
us
even
finds
be
ourselves in.
there might even be an analogy there to religion performing maybe a similar kind of function over
Oh,
across
for
different
sure.
environments.
Yeah, for sure.
Um, so anyway, just maybe it'll make it a little bit more concrete again. One thing that jumps out to me when we're thinking about sort of how cultural ideas spread and the selection pressures that are acting on culture is obviously it's happening in sort of like this cultural domain, which for hundreds of thousands, a few million years, that's sort of been the anchor that natural selection has used to shape the modern human form. But we now seem to live in a world where, at least to me, it's not obvious that like genetic selection sort of is relevant at all. It seems to all be happening in the cultural domain, and in fact, some cultures are, producing citizens, let's say like in Germany, where like the birth rate is very, very low. And in other parts of the world, especially those that have been experiencing, dramatic economic growth, the birth rate is very, very high. So what's happening there in terms of natural selection? Like, are genes even relevant?
Yeah, this is a really interesting phenomenon that demographers call the modern. What does it have to do? It's got a name now that I can't remember what it's called. I feel like it's like the demographic shift or something. So, the demographic transition. Yeah, this is something that evolutionary anthropologists and demographers and basically cultural evolutionists have thought a lot about. Because you're right, like in a purely genetic evolutionary sense, it doesn't make any sense. Why would success lead to a decrease in birth rate? Birth rate is how you transfer your phenotypes, your traits. So how could it just doesn't, like, success should always be followed, be measured even by increased birth rates in a genetic sense. But humans transmit their traits not just through genetics, but also through learning and other kinds of transmission. And we transmit our traits through our culture, through teaching, through observation. Uh, there are plenty of traits that also are like genetics don't not matter, but selection acts on genes much more slowly than it can act on cultural traits, because you can change what gets transmitted almost instantaneously by having people learn different things or by teaching different things. Whereas to change the flow of genes, you have to literally have babies and have them grow up and have babies on their own. So the generational rate is just much slower for genetic traits. I always think about this like 150 years ago, which is how many genetic generations? Like a few. We most people didn't have electricity, didn't have telephones, didn't have televisions, didn't have internet, didn't have electric guitars and Tylenol and airplanes and, you know, I don't know, microphones. Just the sheer number of things that have been credit cards and all kinds of, just so many things that feel integral to our lives didn't exist 150 years ago. And yet the distribution of genes in human populations 150 years ago was almost identical to what it is now. Right? So cultural evolution happens much, much, much faster than genetic evolution.
What do you mean by that? Sorry, the distribution of genes?
The distribution of genes. So imagine an individual has DNA, and they have their DNA is composed of a number of things, but including what we call genes. These are sequences of DNA that code for the activation of different proteins and the activation of other genes that code for proteins at certain times. And they are what sort of, when you have a sperm and an egg, the genes interact with the environment to create a body and a brain, and then the genes interact many, many different ways over the course of the lifespan to, let's say, do things like healing wounds and also like being susceptible to certain diseases or fighting against certain diseases, stuff like that. We know we have DNA, and if you look at a population, you can say, well, most people share most of their genes with other people because we're humans and not other animals. So when you look at the variation, there are certain genes though that differ, right? Most genes can't differ, otherwise you wouldn't get a viable human being. There's only a handful of genes that actually can differ between individuals. Most genes are pretty essential for making a functioning human body. But the genes that aren't can vary, and that's why some people are short and some people are tall, some people are men, some people are women, some people are something different. Some people have blue eyes and brown eyes and dark skin and light skin. Some people are really excitable. Some people are really stoic. And there's variation. And if you look, you can plot sort of how frequent certain genes are in a population. And some genes will be common, some will be rare. That's what I mean by distribution of genes. So you can look at any population and say these genes are common and these genes are rare. These genes tend to correlate. So individuals who have gene A also tend to have gene B, but not gene C. And if you look, the distribution of genes in humans 150 years ago is probably almost identical to what it is now, because there hasn't been that strong a selection on human genes. Now, there are exceptions. There are things like genocide, which does a very good job when you have ethnic genocide of completely eliminating certain genotypes in the population. That's really tragic and horrible. But in general, there's not a very, very strong selection on certain genotypes. And one of the reasons is that one of the characteristic traits of human beings is our immense adaptability. If you compare us to other species, most species are very well adapted to their environment. They have beaks that are perfectly adapted to cracking the nuts that grow by, or they can perfectly get to get nectar out of certain flowers that live in their environment, or they're really good at climbing trees to get something, or they're really good at hiding in the tall grasses that live, near where they live. Humans live in the Arctic. Humans live in the desert. Humans live in the tropics. We live in temperate zones.
We live in cities, modern urban cities.
Yeah, right, exactly. We live in cities of, 20 million people all crowded in apartments, and we live in huts in the middle of nowhere. We live in totally different environments, and yet we're the same species. And a person born into a culture in any one of those places will learn to adapt. And that's actually one of the most amazing things, is that if you put an adult human who is enculturated and has learned to be a human in, let's say, a modern Western city, and you put them in someplace far away where now you take them to the Arctic or you take them to the desert, they're going to do terribly. They have no adaptations for how to live in that environment. But if you take one of their babies and you raise that baby in one of those communities that knows how to deal with those environments, that baby will grow up into an adult that does just fine. Because one of the things that really defines human beings is our ability to learn, an ability to teach, an ability to help each other, and sort of not just learn from each other, but tolerate others learning from us and actually be motivated to help others learn from us. There's all these great examples. They're sometimes called the lost European explorer examples of, European explorers in, let's say, the 1800s getting lost in, let's say, the Australian outback and just starving to death, surrounded by edible food that they don't know how to eat. And where local indigenous people have been living for hundreds or thousands of years totally fine because they have adaptations that mean they know how to survive in that environment. And it's not that the European explorers aren't smart, it's just that they are not enculturated. So the field of cultural evolution tries to take all these things into account when thinking about why human society is the way it is and how it could change or will change. It's also worth saying, well, I have some more to say on this, but I don't know if you want to take it in a different direction.
Yeah, no, please continue.
So one of the things I think that's important, this is going to get a little technical, but people involved in cultural evolution have developed theories about how these things work. And I think really importantly, and this can be a little scary to people sort of used to the verbal rhetorical arguments of the social sciences, we have encoded these things as formal mathematical and computational models to say, this is the kind of way that, let's say, cooperation in groups could work or not work. These are the conditions under which cooperation works, or signaling works, or norm change works, and built models of these kinds of dynamics, both general models, and then these can be applied more specifically. And this allows us to take theories developed in one context and import them to other contexts really well, because we know exactly what the theory says and doesn't say, because they've been encoded in models. And you really can only do that if you formalize your models. I think this is a really important advance in the study of social and behavioral sciences, and I think it's going to just increase in the future. My hope is that in 20 years, you cannot become a social scientist without understanding how mathematical models of social processes work. In the same way that you can't become a physicist now without understanding how mathematical models of physical processes work.
Right. Yeah, and I mean that's how I found you, of course, as you were doing this course, this online course on agent-based modeling, which is programming simple rules for individual agents, which of course can represent humans or anything else. And those simple rules can of course lead to complex behavior, which is just an absolutely fascinating idea. That you can sort of create these simulations to see how what behaviors emerge. Is there any particular sort of area of policy making where you think this kind of modeling and application could really have a notable impact?
Yes and no. I mean, I think that the sad fact is that a lot of the modeling is still kind of at early stages because it's still being done by a relatively small number of individuals who are still figuring out what the right models are and what the right questions are and what the right data is that can test these models. I think most pressing right now are models related to the spread of norms and behaviors in um, large multicultural communities. I mean, one of the modeling areas that's most well developed in the social and behavioral sciences is epidemiology, right? The spread of diseases. And what the models of the spread of diseases have, this is an area that's been formalized since the 1920s. And people have understood, okay, well, if individuals are interacting in particular ways, this is how a course of a disease can work. And these models have gotten very sophisticated, where we can put into things like not just contagion rates and recovery rates, but also things like non-contagious exposures or non-symptomatic exposure times. We can put into things like into these models things like social network structure and other kinds of demographic structure, even very high fine-grained geographical structure, age structure, etc. The thing that these models have not yet well incorporated is the nuances of human behavior that epidemiologists tend not to learn a ton about, but that social scientists, especially those familiar with cultural evolution and other related fields, think a lot about. So things like, how do norms spread under uncertainty? Right? One of the things that's been very difficult, especially in a multicultural, polarized society like the US, where you can say, "Oh, here's a behavior that is going to be important for us to do, so we can stop the spread of a disease." You say, "Well, does it definitely work?" And you say, "Well, yeah, it probably works. It's a really high probability it works." I say, "Well, show me." I say, "Well, the evidence is a little tenuous, but trust us." Well, maybe that works if you have a community where everyone is kind of thinks the same way and can get on board with trusting the same things. But if you have you have a population where there are groups that don't trust each other and don't like each other and don't want to be mistaken for one another and need to assert their dominance over the other, and you have high uncertainty about the efficacy of certain behaviors, like, nobody is arguing whether or not seatbelts work in cars, right? This is not a polarized. It's not like in the US, like Democrats wear seatbelts and Republicans don't wear seatbelts, because it's very obvious that seatbelts work in preventing injury if you have a car crash. But if you have things like wearing face masks and vaccines to prevent the spread of a disease, and it's unclear to some people how effective that is, or they feel like the sources of the data are not trustworthy, then you have a real problem. And then you need to know, what are the impediments to this, and what aspects might help. What are the kinds of strategies that individuals tend to use to learn information under uncertainty, under varying kinds of uncertainty? How do behaviors become social markers if they don't start as social markers? And how can we stop them from becoming social markers, or overcome that impediment once they do become social markers? When I mean a social marker is the idea that some behavior or other kind of recognizable trait is indicative of the kind of person you are, right? So, if you wear a hat and a shirt with the name of a sports team on it, that's a social marker that you are a fan of that sports team, right? If you are in the US and you wear a red hat that says "Make America Great Again," that is a marker that says, I am a certain kind of person and not a different kind of person, right? And unfortunately, in certain parts of the US, if you walk into a store wearing a face mask, that has become a marker that you are a certain kind of person and not another kind of person. And there are places where that's a bad marker to have. And this is the problem that we have to overcome in multicultural societies. And so this is one of the kinds of areas that I think research in cultural evolution is really important.
One of the things you said there is, about social learning. And I know that, there's what seems to me as a layperson pretty well-grounded theory that prestige-based learning plays a massive role in distributing certain norms and ideas and concepts and skills. So the idea being, of course, like there's certain people in our group, in our population, who sort of have demonstrated success in a particular domain, and we preferentially seek those people out to learn from them. With something like COVID, obviously in certain parts of the world, like in your country, like the people who we would think are those prestigious individuals, those experts, are often not being preferentially seeked out by other parts of the population. So what's going on there? Are there sort of like subpopulations that are looking at the prestigious individuals of the subpopulations are, actually saying something completely different than the prestigious individuals in the other subpopulation?
Yeah, I mean, here at least, that's exactly what's going on, is that you have a fragmented population. And it also relates back to what I was talking about before in terms of media bias and manufacturing consent. Since the increasing fragmentation of the media by things like first cable news and then the internet, instead of media companies sort of going for the middle, trying to get the largest possible audiences, media companies have instead tried to get certain extremely loyal subsections of the population. And you end up with effectively competing factions that, and media people know that things like disgust and outrage drive views and clicks, and things like measured facts and admissions of vagueness or uncertainty or ambiguity don't. So you end up with a media landscape that foments and exacerbates this kind of, for lack of a better word, tribalism or parochialism. So you make a really important point about prestige bias, and this is something that cultural evolutionists think a lot about, is that if you need to learn from somebody and there's opacity, like you don't know what the best thing to do is, a good heuristic, a good way of thinking is, well, look for the people who are successful and influential and respected, and do what they do or do what they say. This works pretty well under a lot of cases. But the issue is, right, when you have competing prestigious individuals and that denigrate others. So if you have prestigious individuals in your community say that medical experts and government officials are untrustworthy or are evil, then that's going to make you not trust them, or is likely to make you untrust, or at least creates a dilemma for you where you have to then resolve it. Either the person you've been listening to is untrustworthy, or the person they say is untrustworthy. Or, perhaps neither of them are trustworthy, but people often feel like it's important. I mean, you have this, sense of community that people need. So this is what's going on. And this is part of what I mean by sometimes I'm hopeful about, how we can use these kinds of techniques and ideas to build a better society. But to some extent, one of the major things it can do right now is identify the places that are really doing damage, the areas where damage is really being done, explore and explain exactly how and why they're doing damage, and therefore perhaps create enough shared knowledge and sentiment and desire to change those circumstances that they do. I'm not sure it will, but sometimes I'm hopeful that it will.
You start out there when you're talking about fragmentation in the media, talking about that they're starting to cultivate these very loyal followings of sort of specific niches. And you also mentioned that's what's happening in the internet. So do researchers like yourself consider the internet to be almost like a qualitatively different technology to typical technologies or tools that we invent to improve our way of life and be more efficient? because it seems like in terms of the way that information spreads and that we create relationships with other people, there's a paradox, it seems, because on the one hand, I can make friends with whoever I want on the internet from a different culture. We have to share some sort of common understanding. I mean, we're having this conversation now. We connected over the internet. That would have never happened, 100 years ago if I'm just living in my small town. But on the other hand, it's precisely because we can create those connections that these sort of it creates increasingly fragmented society where I'm no longer really associating with like my neighbors down the street as part of this like geographically anchored society, but I'm now relating with people who share my beliefs, who might be in other parts of the world, and creating a bit of a barrier between those who are actually live in the same area as me and have the same voting rights as me.
Right. Yeah. That's absolutely true. And it's something that I and a lot of other people have thought quite a lot about, and are trying to figure out and mesh with what we know about general principles of human behavior. In at least in sort of what I might consider the classic cultural evolutionary view that came out of evolutionary ecology and anthropology, starting in the late 1970s and 1980s. And it was mostly done by anthropologists and ecologists interested in understanding sort of how sort of humans went from being a very interesting and smart ape to the kind of creature that could build societies. And it was mostly sort of thinking about that sort of up to the point of small scale foraging hunter-gatherer style groups. There's also been a push by fewer people and more recently to think about that sort of second transition, how do you go from small scale societies, let's say at the dawn of agriculture 10, 11,000 years ago, to things like city states and empires. That's super interesting as well. And a lot of work has been done on that. The next step is the fact that just in the last few decades, we have this new thing called the internet, which, yeah, you're right, completely has changed everything about the way we interact and about the way information flows and about the way communities form. Now, information scientists and social theorists have been thinking about the internet since its creation, right? There's really interesting theory and work done in trying to understand how interactions work on the internet that goes back at least to the 1980s, or sorry, 1990s, maybe the 1980s. In terms of how it works with the deeper theoretical work that's been done trying to understand human culture, that's much more recent. And I think it's still not quite fleshed out. Now, I am part of a group among other groups that has been doing a bit of work to try to understand how interactions over something like the internet interacts with the fact that we still do interact with people physically, right, in our local neighborhoods, the people we know and we see every day, and how these things interact with each other, right? We form communities online, but if they only stayed online, that would just be this thing that we did. It would influence information flow in an interesting way, but it wouldn't be as important and as serious as the fact that networks that form online then have influence back into the real world. It becomes an opportunity for people to organize, right? You look at, I don't want to make it too sort of U.S. centric, but it's where I am and it's where I think about, in here in the U.S. just not that long ago, we had an attack by our own citizens on our government building, right, on the Capitol on January 6th, and that was largely organized on the internet by people who got together from all around the country and figured out a way to coordinate on a single day, and very likely coordinated with people to make sure that there wasn't uh, as much security as there should have been, and other kinds of things. Um, so these things have real consequences. There's the flip side, right? There's the good things, right? Like if you look at let's say the protests in the late aughts, in the Middle East, that were organized largely on Twitter. It's sort of anti-establishment, like in Egypt, right? Um, those are very pro-democracy, and they happened online too. Um, so we have these new kinds of ways of interacting, and they have both extremely good consequences in the sense that um, underrepresented groups and views can be heard, and people who are marginalized or oppressed can find sympathizers and co-conspirators and people who they can have a better life with and organize to make a better life with. But also, you have disinformation and misinformation spreading. And if you have your crazy neighbor who believes that aliens uh, invented COVID and spread it so that they could, invade a weaker population. And that person is living in the middle of nowhere, or just not even in the middle of nowhere, in a town. And they can only interact with other people in the town. They're probably going to get shut down or not have an influence. But if they can go online and connect with other people all around the world and form a community, not only can they spread their information, but that information can then persist and get amplified and evolve and get better at spreading.
Yeah, it's almost as if that just the mere act of having a receptive ear, actually, um, it instantiates that belief. Because I can connect with somebody, it actually sort of it puts it more concretely in my mind, and then by proxy in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And people learn also when we talk about social learning, people learn from each other about how to best spread information, including misinformation and disinformation. Have become very good at figuring out how to make information um, attractive and sort of make, I guess, the internet equivalent of an earworm, like something that gets is easy to remember and to transmit. And then you have organizations like, let's say, Facebook and YouTube, who are the conduits for this, who are not at all financially incentivized to do anything to prevent. So they're happy to let those things spread because it keeps people online. And then you also, I mean, the one argument is what we should do about that. And I don't, this is getting a little bit outside my area, but I just want to briefly comment on it is, one argument of what we should do about that is to make sure that governments um, demand that these companies do the right thing and um, enforce better norms and don't allow disinformation. But the danger of that, right, is then you make it so that only giant companies will have the resources to actually have people working on all the things you need to enforce those kinds of checks, so that competitors can't compete at all, because a small company will never be able to do all the kinds of security um, and quality control that the big companies can. So then you basically just you make permanent monopolies. So there are downsides to that too. So people have argued that instead what we should do is make it so that these companies no longer can keep the information on their own, and you have to legislate transferability, interoperability between things like Facebook and Twitter and whatever, so that other companies could use their information and send and receive messages from them, which is its own cultural evolutionary problem in a way.
That's really interesting because, like, I always think if I'm somebody who is sharing some views that are relatively controversial. Maybe it's some hardcore like denying the election results kind of stuff, and let's say Twitter doesn't want to promote those views. If I've already got that mindset and I've already connected with other people who have that mindset, just policing the platforms is just going to push me underground because I see that effort to police as happening by like a hostile force. But if all the platforms were interoperable, I think that's the term you use. That's more how things work, I guess, in real life, at least if we're communicating with each other through like the conduit of air and sound waves. Where you can't just shut those things down. You give them the space that they in some sense deserve, and they live and die by I guess the battle of the war of ideas and who can communicate the best, which is a little bit more of a, I guess, closer to our nature in some respect.
Yeah, yeah, right. I mean, this is something I've thought less about than a lot of other things, but I've read recently some very convincing arguments for interoperability. And I think it's because I read recently two books, one by the computational social scientist Sinan Aral, and one by the writer and media scholar Cory Doctorow. And I think of these two people as being very philosophically opposed in many, many ways. And yet they both argued strongly for interoperability. And I thought, well, maybe there's something to this.
Yeah. I'm conscious that we are, we've been talking for a while and we're approaching time. So I just got a couple of last questions. One of them is, what's one thing or one concept that you think like could really help the layperson make sense of the world? A heuristic that really like clarifies their reality.
Yeah. It's tough. I think that to some extent, I'm gonna give you an answer, but before I give you an answer, I'm gonna tell you why I'm very cautious about giving you an answer, which is I think that there is this mindset that is very common in the sort of what you might call the Western world, the sort of European descendant world, which is the idea of instant enlightenment. It's the idea that all it will take is some single insight or concept, and all of a sudden everything will click into place, and I will finally the veil will fall, and I will see the doors of perception will open, and I will see the world as it is. I think that is rarely true. Even when people feel that way, I think it's often kind of a mirage. I think real insight and real enlightenment takes effort and practice, and is something that you have to constantly work on. Because it's so easy to fool yourself, and it's so easy to think that now you understand things because you had this one insight, and there's no insight that is going to apply to all situations and give you perfect understanding of everything just by knowing one thing. So I would say that if there's any one, the long answer, and I'll give you an actual thing after this, but is that to make a deliberate effort to understand the world in a sort of, and understand that understanding the world is really complicated. There's a story I like, and it's very cliche to quote or talk about Albert Einstein, but I really like this one in particular. Is that there's a story that Albert Einstein was once asked, how come we've made all these amazing advances in our understanding of the atom and the universe and physics, and yet we don't understand, and yet our own, society and politics is so convoluted and difficult. And he said, well, that's because politics is much harder than physics. And there's a related quote by another physicist, Murray Gell-Mann, who once said, imagine how much harder physics would be if electrons could think. It's really complicated to understand people. right? Because we have history and we have minds and we have conflict and cooperation. We have certain goals that are aligned and certain goals that are opposed at different times and in different contexts and different periods in our lives. It's so complicated. Um, and understanding people is not easy or simple. Um, so I think recognizing that is valuable in and of itself. That said, I think if there's one concept that I think about more and often, so often, all the time, it's selection. And it's something I mentioned earlier. Right? It's the fact that humans are incentivized. We have our individual psychology, we have our motivations. Um, we have the things that we like to do and don't like to do, and we have the things that reward us, and we have the things that punish us, and we can choose, and we have the things that make us feel good and make us feel bad. But we live in a society that has structure. Certain kinds of people are in certain kinds of jobs and certain kinds of positions that are rewarded or not rewarded. We have certain affordances or things that we are able to do or driven to do or pushed to do, and certain things that we are prevented from doing or discouraged from doing or prohibited from doing. Certain relationships that we are encouraged or prohibited or discouraged from. Why? Right? It's because we live in a society. Part of the reason is that society shapes itself, and the nature of the society then promotes certain kinds of behaviors and certain kinds of mindsets and certain kinds of worldviews, certain kinds of institutions, and not others. And there's feedback, right? So the fact that society selects for certain kinds of voices and certain kinds of institutions and not others means that certain kinds of individuals will find success and not others, which means that the nature of things in general, the way that society works, the norms that we have, the things that seem obvious to people and the things that seem impossible or unlikely to people, are shaped by the pressures that made it so that certain kinds of individuals have their voices heard and others don't.
Yeah, right. Just got one more question, which is I'm just curious about what you are currently fascinated by. Like, what problem are you working on? Are you thinking about before you go to bed, etc.?
Yeah. I think I'm currently working. I'm working on too many projects currently, but the things that one is I'm working on. I'm trying to write a textbook on modeling for social behavior and cultural evolution. So I've been working very hard on that and trying to finish a draft by the end of the summer. Um, but the other thing I think that it's been kind of a minor obsession of mine and increasingly a major obsession of mine over the last 5, 6, 7 years is identity. And I think that the way we usually think of identity is in a kind of psychology or social psychology way, that it's about the experience of being me, who I am, where am I in the world, who am I, who are you, what does it mean to be me, what does it mean to be me, my individual, what does it mean to be me in terms of my ethnicity and my gender and my race and my generation or whatever. And I think those things are really important. But I also think that thinking about things in a sort of cultural evolutionary sense makes me very aware that human behaviors have consequences and strategies have consequences. And the way that we identify is not just an internal feeling, it's a display, right? We display to the world the kind of person that we are. And we do it in very complex ways, right? We do it in ways where we'd express certain aspects of ourselves in certain contexts with certain people and not others. We express certain aspects of ourselves very subtly sometimes so that some people might pick up on a cue and others might not, right? So that we can talk to multiple people at the same time, and different members of our audience will take different things from our communication. And we do this both unconsciously as well as deliberately. And I'm fascinated by the different ways in which we do this. And one of the reasons why is if you think about the way humans were 10,000, 15, 20,000 years ago, or even now in different parts of the world. If you live in a small society and most of the people who you interact with are like you, they have the same norms as you, they have the same general worldview and beliefs as you, and most of the people you interact with are people that you know either directly, maybe you've known them all your life, or at least indirectly, someone you know knows them. The way you classify people is going to be very, very different than the way we classify people in a large scale multicultural society. Right? If you live in a small scale society, you're going to be interacting mostly with people who you know a lot about and can assume a lot about. And therefore, the way you represent them can be extremely nuanced and have to do with their individual behavior and all the behaviors that they have. And all the things that you know about them can be incorporated into your views of them. Can contrast that with the way that we live now. If you live in a multicultural city, in a multicultural country, right, where you're interacting with people from different religions, different ethnic backgrounds, who speak different languages, who have different political views, you can't assume nearly as the same amount. You are going into a situation where if you don't know anything about this person, you don't know what to think. You don't know what kinds of things are going to be reasonable for you to say, what kinds of things you shouldn't say, what kinds of expectations you can have or should have about them. And so we have adapted very nuanced ways of learning about and signaling to others the kind of people that we are and figuring out what kind of people they are so that we can know, okay, I should probably avoid that person. Oh, that person looks like someone I would probably have a lot in common with. Oh, this person I can probably have these kinds of interactions with, but not others. I could probably like have an economic interaction with them, but I shouldn't talk politics with them. Or that person, oh, is, look, that person's into the same weird band I'm into. Maybe they're also into some of the other weird stuff that I'm into. We signal incredibly subtly and complexly about the kinds of people we are because cooperation and coordination is so important. Because figuring out how to work with other people is so important to us, and figuring out what people to avoid or to aggress against even is important. So we need to figure out what kinds of interactions we can have because cooperation and coordination and norms are so important. And we live in a society where we can't assume, like, where you don't, if you just, all you know is someone is a person who lives in your city, you can't infer how they're going to be able to cooperate or compete with you. You need to have some more information. And I think this is a huge part of what identity has become in our modern societies. So I'm fascinated with how identity works and how things like subcultures emerge and function within larger societies, how people adapt their identities depending on their contexts. This is one of the major areas in which I continue to work.
Yeah, I can see. It fascinates me as well. All of the above. Identity is something that I think about quite often. I think maybe is the golden nugget, I guess, at the heart of everything. But anyway, that is as much as I'd love to continue. That is like all we have time for. So, Paul, I really appreciate you making the time to have this call. It's been a wonderful chat. I've really enjoyed picking your brain. So thanks very much. Is there anything you want to share, like sort of stuff that you're working on or places people can follow your work, anything like that?
I feel like I've shared quite a bit. First of all, thanks, Matt. It was a real pleasure. I am eminently Googleable. You can find me at my website, on Twitter, and those are probably the main places that you can find me and find videos of me talking or papers that I've written or just tweets of me, about sharing bad jokes on the internet.
Awesome. Cool. All right. Well, we'll sign off there. Thanks again, Paul. Really appreciate it.
Of course.